We have our next speaker hanging out backstage. We have Astrid Anderson joining us. She's a conservation biologist, and her research focuses on wildlife trade and critically endangered yellow crested cockatoos. She's a National Geographic explorer, a member of the University of Hong Kong's Conservation Forensics Laboratory and the Hong Kong Wildlife Trade Working Group. She's recently authored scientific papers on the trade of hippo teeth, shark fins, and elephant ivory. She's also the founder of Hong Kong for Pangolins. So I'm going to bring her in live with us right now. Hey, Astrid, how are you?
Hi, yeah, very good. Happy to be here on it's World Biodiversity Day, isn't it? So this is
certainly
a
is. Yeah, we're thrilled to have you joining us. And pangolins came up in your introduction, and I don't know if you saw, we had a great event with Mark in Nigeria, and he rescues orphan pangolins and then reintroduces them to the wild. So it was a fun event where he had one of his young charges with him who was trying to look for ants in his ear. It was
That's so
I can't believe he stayed so focused.
Yeah, that would be very distracting.
Yeah. Well, Astrid, it's so great to have you. I know normally you're in Hong Kong, but I believe you're coming to us live from Finland today. I'll let you take over for a little bit, and then we'll have a question or two afterwards.
Sounds good. All right. I will just share my screen. All righty. Yeah.
All right. It's loading. Looking good.
All good?
Perfect. You're good.
Okay. Yeah. So the title of my talk today is kind of interesting. It's Aliens in the City. And it basically alludes to one of the lesser known issues to do with traded species, which is what I focus on in my research. So Joe mentioned that, I work on a lot of different traded species and have done in the past, such as elephants or sharks or hippos, even pangolins. But one of the unintended consequences of trading wildlife is that sometimes if you trade it when it's live, they can escape, or even if they're kept as pets, they can be released or unintentionally released, or even intentionally if the owner doesn't want to keep it anymore, right? And then they find themselves in a completely alien environment, so to speak. So we see this occurring with exotic species that are traded in wildlife trade. And it's kind of an interesting angle. So yeah, as Joe mentioned, I'm Dr. Astrid. Oh, what happened? I'm a conservation biologist, and yeah, very happy to be here today to talk to you about this topic. So this map here is just to illustrate the connections that are made between countries and continents when wildlife is traded. This map is of mammals, birds, and reptiles that were traded live legally in 2014. So everything from like snakes to parrots to little, marmosets or something, and just the different trade routes that they take and they're shipped between. And as I mentioned, this can result in escapees forming wild populations in these new countries and in these new cities where they find themselves, and sometimes surviving there and just living in this alien environment. So often this actually is happening in cities. It's kind of counterintuitive. That's not what we would typically think. We would think, okay, wildlife, if it found itself in a weird place, it would probably run away from where the humans are, right, to the like natural bit. But actually, no, because a lot of the trade happens between major cities, and a lot of pets are kept by people living in cities, and a lot of the shops or markets where pets or wildlife is traded are found in cities. That's usually where they escape, and that's also where they can sometimes find food easily. They can find more places to hide and places to basically find ways to survive. And often it's actually parrots that are used as an example. There's a lot of parrots that live in cities where outside of the range where they're typically found. So in North America, I know there are macaw populations in Florida, for example, and there's also different rose-ringed parakeets that are living in cold European cities in the Netherlands and also in London, and just finding a way to survive there. And that's because parrots are they're quite good at adapting. They can be very, good at problem solving and finding a way to survive. They're also heavily traded. They're very popular as a pet. So it means there's more of them, more chances of them escaping and producing these ex situ populations, as we call them. So the species that I focused on for my PhD research was the yellow-crested cockatoo, which is this fella here. He's typically found in Indonesia, although Indonesia is massive. It's like all of this. The yellow-crested cockatoo is just found on these orange highlighted islands. There's still a lot of islands. That's where the species is native to, and they are heavily traded. So in the 80s and early 90s, there was 96,700 yellow-crested cockatoos exported from Indonesia legally. There's trade records and everything about it, and that was just all legal trade. But clearly it was too much, right? Because now there's very few of them left, actually. And in 2004, trade in wild-caught yellow-crested cockatoos was made basically illegal. So this happened before then and depleted the populations quite a lot. But since 2004, unfortunately, the demand has not, disappeared. So there is still illegal trade. Like in this photo you see here, there's a yellow-crested cockatoo stuffed into a bottle, and that was intercepted by Indonesian customs in 2014. So there were actually 23 of these guys, and it was some smugglers trying to traffic them, probably wild-caught yellow-crested cockatoos, because the shipment was seized in Indonesia, where they are found in the wild still. And I guess they were probably destined to be sold in a shop or a market or somewhere, in a legal way, because you're still allowed to trade yellow-crested cockatoos that have come from a captive breeding facility. So if they've come from a farm or some smaller breeding facility. So, but it's difficult to tell the difference, right? If you're in a shop, you don't really know if it's come from the wild or if it's come from a farm. So now there's only 2,500 of these guys remaining, which is very small if you consider that there were over 97,000 exported in the 80s. So they're listed now as critically endangered in Indonesia. And as a result of the rampant trade, Hong Kong has an introduced population of these guys. So Hong Kong, Singapore, US, and Europe were some of the major destinations that these cockatoos were being transported to. And in Hong Kong, they've now escaped. Well, over the last 50, 60 years, individuals have either escaped because they're really clever and they can find ways out of things, or they have been released because they actually live for 70-ish years, 70. So they can outlive their owners. They're quite noisy. Hong Kong apartments are tiny, so it might not be the best place to keep a parrot like this. But anyway, there's now 200 of these guys flying around the very urban center of Hong Kong. And you can see them, across the island, the main island, where when you think of Hong Kong, the iconic image that comes into your mind is the skyscrapers, the residential buildings, the office buildings. And that's exactly where these guys are flying around, 200 of them, which is almost 10% of the remaining global population. So I actually, as part of my PhD, collated some sighting records from the Hong Kong Birdwatching Society, and noticed that most of the sighting records since 1964 are in the urban areas of Hong Kong Island. There's lots of green actually in Hong Kong. You don't normally see that in the, videos of tourism boards or whatever, but there are lots of protected areas. However, these guys, the cockatoos, they tend to stay in these areas of white on the map, which is the really, really super urban areas. And in huge groups as well. Especially in the evenings, they come together to roost. So they sleep in like kind of a communal situation. And this photo I took in Hong Kong Park, which is right in the financial heart of Hong Kong. These are all the buildings around are all like, major international banks, offices, bankers on their conference calls, and they have these critically endangered birds flying outside their window. It's kind of a crazy situation. But if you're here at like 6 p.m. during sunset, you will see loads of groups of cockatoos flying in from different parts of the city to come and roost together in this central park of Hong Kong, sort of, so to speak. And we've recorded up to 100 individuals there at one time. So they really like to come together in a group, and it's quite an interesting spectacle to see, these cockatoos screeching around in the center of the city. So in a way, it's kind of an interesting new area that people are starting to think about, is that cities can kind of act as safe havens for certain species that are maybe threatened in their native ranges. So for these cockatoos, for example, they are still being poached and smuggled, as you saw in the bottles and things in Indonesia to a certain extent. And they're threatened by habitat loss in Indonesia, right? So they're losing their trees that they need for the nesting and feeding and all that. Whereas in Hong Kong or other cities, they might not face those same exact challenges, So in a way, cities can provide these biodiversity arcs, as one researcher has called them, and maybe even prevent the global extinction of certain species, and be instrumental or important for future conservation efforts as well. So, and as well, they provide a nice opportunity to interact with nature. Like, I grew up in Hong Kong, and I remember walking around and just hearing these screeching and looking up and seeing this weird bird with this mohawk, I was like, what is that? And as a city kid, I didn't really see that sort of thing. So it was really engaging and interesting. And it's that typically species, when they come to a new environment, it's seen as a negative thing. And many times it can be a negative thing. So a new species can cause all sort of havoc in an ecosystem. But when we're talking about cities, which are already concrete jungles, completely changed by humans, not recognizable for what they were, before when it was natural, then we can maybe have this different way of thinking that maybe it's not such a bad thing, Maybe it could have some benefits. However, it's important also to acknowledge that in cities, the species that are there can face their own challenges and limitations and difficulties. So for these cockatoos, we have had a major overarching question. Me and my PhD supervisor, and now my postdoc supervisor, Dr. Caroline Dingle, and also Professor Juha Merilä. We're trying to figure out, what is the conservation value of this population? Like, are they doing well? Are they healthy? Basically, these three elements. Number one, are they safe in Hong Kong? Number two, are they successfully reproducing? Are the young cockatoo baby chicks, are they surviving? Are they fledging? And number three, are they healthy? Are they genetically healthy? Are they inbreeding? Are they hybridizing? Do they carry diseases? This type of thing, because this is all very important to information if we want to figure out what role this population can play in the future of conservation for yellow-crested cockatoos. So for the first question, are they safe? There have been a few incidents recorded of cockatoo poaching in Hong Kong, actually. But because it's so densely populated, it doesn't really go unnoticed. So this happened in a residential area in Hong Kong, where someone that was just, minding their own business in their apartment saw this guy climbing up a tree and apparently reaching into a nest cavity that two cockatoos were using, and just taking out the chick. So there's been a few also, I've seen on Facebook groups, some reports of people seeing this sort of thing, but it's pretty infrequent. And but you can kind of see why or what the motivation would be behind this, because in the market in Hong Kong, we have also seen lots of yellow-crested cockatoos for sale. But as I mentioned, you can't really tell. You're allowed to sell captive bred ones, right? But you're not allowed to sell wild ones, though it's difficult to tell the difference. So you could get away with selling a wild caught one and saying it's captive bred, probably. So what we did as part of my PhD's research in the Dingle lab, me and some other researchers did these market surveys. We would basically walk around the bird market in Hong Kong every 2 weeks and count the number of different bird species that we saw and the number of individuals within that species, including the yellow-crested cockatoos. So we would get an idea of, during it was a 1.5 year period, how many yellow-crested cockatoos did we see? And we would note down information, about which individual shop they were found in. We would take photos if we could. We would say if they had a leg band with an ID number and what other birds were in the shop at the same time, just to try and prevent any double counting, So we ended up counting during this period, 2017-18, 33 unique individual yellow-crested cockatoos in the market, which, is more than there's only been records of 10 being imported in the last 13 years. So where have these other 23 individuals come from? Have they been locally bred, which is a legal gray area, so they're captive reared by like hobbyists and things, or have they been taken from the wild in Indonesia and trafficked to Hong Kong and then sold in this market, or have they been actually poached within Hong Kong and sold in the market, both of which are illegal? And we developed a tool where, based on differences in diet between wild and captive bred cockatoos, you can tell in the feathers, with the carbon ratios especially, whether they've been feeding on a wild diet or a captive diet. So you can actually go to the market, well, the authorities could, the government, right, and take feather samples and then check if this bird has been feeding on a diet that is more like a wild bird. And so we did that. We published the results in a paper, and I can answer more questions if you want afterwards about it. It was, one chapter of my PhD. Another chapter was about the breeding. So are they reproducing well, as I mentioned? And they basically breed in these big holes, if you will, in the tree, in big trees. And myself and, again, members of the Dingle lab would sit outside these cavities in Hong Kong. Most of them were very accessible. Like, as I said, in the major urban area of Hong Kong, you can see this fella. He has a bit of a balding on his head because of over excessive preening from his partner, her partner, actually, I should say. This is the female. Mute that. So we would sit by these cavities with our binoculars and just every couple of days for the breeding season, which lasts about 4 months, trying to record, if the juveniles poke their head out of the hole, and if they're being, or if the eggs are being incubated, or what stage of the breeding is happening, and then whether or not the juveniles are seen fledging, and if they're seen flying around being fed by the mother outside of the hole. Because once they actually fledge, they get out of the cavity and the nest, they actually look exactly like an adult almost. So it's difficult to see which one is the chick, but you can tell from the behavior of the mother feeding the chick. So that's another element of the research. And the last question that I'll spend a little bit more time on if I have time is the genetic health of the yellow-crested cockatoos in Hong Kong. So in order to assess that, we've had to actually get blood samples with the assistance of vets from the wild population. So to do that, we've been trapping yellow-crested cockatoos in Hong Kong with the correct permits and all of the correct assistance, and safely taking some blood samples from vets helping with that. And we now have over 30 yellow-crested cockatoo samples. It's actually been supplemented also, not just the trapping, but some, like this guy in the photo here, he was a rescued cockatoo, wild cockatoo that was found injured and then was treated at a rehabilitation center. And we cooperate with those rehabilitation centers to take blood from those types of cases as well. And if any, unfortunately, end up dying of natural causes and are found, we can also take samples from them. So now I showed you the map before of the cockatoo sightings, right, across the last, since the 60s. This is the major park in Hong Kong that I was talking about before, where we see 100 individuals. These are some other roost sites to the east and west. And we now have samples from almost across the Hong Kong cockatoo population. So with this, we're going to do some genetic analysis to check, the questions that I mentioned. And to do so, we need to first just figure out the subspecies. Well, we want to figure out in Hong Kong, where did these birds come from? Which islands in Indonesia did they come from? Because it's kind of important to see whether they are pure or whether they've been mixing together. And as I mentioned, so if we zoom in on these islands where the cockatoos are found in Indonesia, you can see these 7 described subspecies, which are split between these islands. So this subspecies is found here, the orange crested is found here, etc. These are all 7 subspecies of yellow crested cockatoo. And these were described by Nigel Collar and Stuart Marsden, and they used museum specimens to decide that there were these 7 subspecies found on these different islands based on the differences in wing measurements and beak measurements and crest measurements and those types of things. So we have actually now got museum samples, small tissue samples from these museum specimens from these different 7 subspecies. And we have extracted DNA from them, even though they're like 150 years old, these specimens. But, now we're going to use that to compare with the Hong Kong samples that we've got and to try and see, do they match, right? Do the Hong Kong individuals do they look most similar in their genetic sequence to the ones found on this island in Indonesia, or are they a hot mess and they're all mixed up? So yeah, that's basically the summary of my PhD research. And these are my 2 supervisors that I mentioned earlier and my collaborators. And yeah, I'll take any questions that you have.
All right, Astrid, thank you so much. That was a great presentation. Lots of information to digest. A few questions here while we have a few moments. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering about, how do people in Hong Kong feel about them? I know they can be loud. I know, potentially they could be a little destructive. Do they view them as a pest, or is there kind of an excitement that they're there in the city?
Yeah, this is a great question. We did actually do a questionnaire with Hong Kong residents that live in the areas where the cockatoos hang out the most. And the responses that we got were mostly positive. They were mostly people saying that they thought they were funny or interesting or like a lovely thing. There was, of course, a few complaints about noise and destruction. They tend to, be a bit curious about things and get into places. But overall, people were excited about them. And right. There was some also people thought that they were the Australian cockatoo that is found there. So they look very similar to the one found in Australia, which is the sulfur crested. Yeah. It's very confusing. But they're not. They're the ones from Indonesia, which are critically endangered. And when we then contacted people and told them that, they were even more excited. They were like, wow, we have a critically endangered species here. That is amazing.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah. Yeah, I know from experience. I lived in Australia for a year, and the sulfur-crested cockatoos are beautiful, but sometimes really early, first thing in the morning, they're not your favorite. Yeah. They can be loud. Okay, so you showed that distribution where they're really focusing on those urban areas. Is that because that's where they were released from? Could they survive in the other areas? Would there be enough food if they We're in the more rural region.
Yeah, that is also a great question. So we tried to look into this as part of my PhD as well. And we kind of noticed a correlation between the urban parks where they were mostly concentrated and large distribution of large trees. So in Hong Kong, there was a lot of deforestation, like historically. So even though it's green, it's quite like smallish trees, you know?
Mhm.
Whereas in the urban parks, they were kind of maybe protected from that to a certain extent. So they have kind of
Okay.
most of the big old trees that the cockatoos need to nest in.
Right.
And also in urban parks, there's a lot of these exotic ornamental tree species planted that maybe fruit or flower and provide food in different parts of the year for the cockatoos that they can. So they kind of stick to that area for that reason, I think. But it is very interesting.
Okay. Yeah. No, it makes total sense. They need those bigger trees for the nest cavities. Yeah, makes total sense. The paper you mentioned, where you could look at take a feather sample and kind of look at the diet.
Mm.
It sounds like you have some results. What were you seeing looking at those birds?
So we saw a significant difference in carbon ratios between wild and captive yellow-crested cockatoos because the wild cockatoos were feeding on a type of like more plants that you find in the wild. So the flowers and fruits and things that you would find in the wild, whereas captive cockatoos were feeding on pellet food mostly, which contained corn. And corn has got a really different carbon ratio signature.
Sure.
So this was really apparent in the feathers, and that was super exciting because then we could, show this to the government and say this is something that you could use maybe in combination with other tools to kind of try and figure out where these cockatoos are coming from. Because why are there so many in the market? It's really weird.
Yeah. Okay. So that's kind of the next step is now hopefully the authorities will dig a little bit deeper and maybe test some of those in the markets.
Yeah, we have actually a really good relationship with the government because Hong Kong is so small. It's great. We can just email them or WhatsApp them. And we gave presentations to the relevant people about our findings. And yeah, we hope to, take it further and actually apply this science to conservation because that's what it's all about, I think.
All right. Amazing. Okay, Astrid, thank you so much. Where can we follow along if people want to dive a little bit deeper? Can you remind us how we can do that?
Yes. Well, we don't have a Cockatoo website just yet, but you can follow me on Twitter or Instagram. Twitter, I'm AA Anderson, and in Instagram, I'm Astrid Alex Anderson. So yeah, that's where it is right now, where it's at. But we're hoping to develop more in the future.
Yeah, no, of course.
Mm-hmm.
All right, perfect. Well, Astrid, thank you so much for joining us. It's fascinating research and the thought of cities as biodiversity arcs. I don't think a lot of people have thought about that. And there's certain species that cities just, they're well adapted to that city life. And yeah, I can see people being on board too, because the concrete jungle isn't for everybody, and to have life around you is is really important, I think, just for health of people, mental health. And so yeah.
And if they're designed well with good urban parks that have connectivity, they don't need to be urban ecological wastelands. They can sustain nature as well alongside people.
Yeah, absolutely. Astrid, thank you so much for being with us, joining us from Finland en route to Hong Kong. It was great to see you. Great to catch up on a little bit of your research. And of course, we're going to be following along.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks so much, Astrid.